Hey everyone, I'm here to introduce today's seminar speaker, Dr. Brian Lurch. Brian is the new UC Davis Center for Population Biology postdoc, and he works with Sebastian Schreiber and many others on main campus. Brian moved here 9 months ago, you said, at the start of this academic year. He moved over here after finishing up his PhD last year at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before that, he did his undergrad and master's in Ohio at Case Western Reserve University, and I think we're very lucky to have Brian here. Brian had many choices for his postdoc. I think I saw that he declined, 4 competitive external postdoc fellowships, so we're lucky to have landed him here at Davis. So Brian's research integrates ecology and evolution of animal behavior, often using mathematical and statistical models to explore those processes and how they shape population biology, and a lot of his work focuses on reproductive and social behavior and the evolution of it, and he's got a lot of cool work on baboons as well, which I think we're going to see today. And it's really cool to have a very quantitative person here to maybe open up our horizons here at BML, and it's also really great to have such a emerging young scholar here as well. So without further ado, let's welcome Brian to BML.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, thanks, everyone. I've had a great time here so far. I'm kind of in tourist mode, so it's kind of like, I don't know, it's sad I have to give a talk now. I was just out at some tide pools. And no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, really excited to be here. So I'm a theoretical population biologist. I'm interested in understanding links between ecology, evolutionary biology, and animal behavior using mathematical models. And I think I want to start the talk by just explaining, why I feel this integrative work is important. I'm guessing many of you also feel your research is somewhere at this interface. And I think that it's important, and the reason that so much work currently is at the intersection of these different fields is because there's this history of siloing. And to see this kind of historical contingency, I want to take a brief trip back to the middle of the 20th century, when we were thinking about the origins of modern evolutionary theory, like the modern synthesis, things like Sewall Wright's work on adaptive landscapes. This was occurring at roughly the same time as Konrad Lorenz's work on imprinting that won the Nobel Prize and was really seminal for the study of animal behavior. And these were kind of roughly occurring at the same time, a little bit before the origin of theoretical ecology, and at least kind of the modern study of theoretical ecology and stuff like MacArthur's work on island biogeography. And we see from each of these examples that even though these fields were kind of spawning at the same time, the kind of insights in these different fields were really growing up in isolation from one another. And as a result of that, the way that ecology, evolutionary biology, and animal behavior are studied are, in some ways, maybe less integrated than the actual underlying biology. That's, of course, not to say that we haven't learned a lot exploring these links. Like I said, I'm guessing, much research happening right here, and much of your research also explores these links. Maybe the most obvious is the role that ecology plays in shaping evolution. Hutchinson had this beautiful metaphor that ecology sets the stage that evolution plays out on. And many of these really exciting examples of natural selection in action make this link clear. At the same time, in the last 30 years, it's become clear that evolution can also occur on ecological timescales. And as a result, evolution can drive ecological dynamics. Links between evolution and behavior are also quite deep. So one example of this is social evolution theory, where it's obviously about how behavior can evolve, but really the key insight is how social behavior generates a social environment that actually favors the evolution of certain cooperative strategies. And finally, links between ecology and behavior also have some really exciting examples, things like niche construction, these charismatic organisms. So we've learned a lot exploring these links, but what I'm going to hopefully convince you of today is that there's still a lot more integration to be done, and there's a lot of really exciting questions at the interface of ecology, evolutionary biology, and animal behavior. And I'm going to tell you kind of 2 ways in which I've worked at this intersection. The first example is looking at social group fissions, and the second example is looking at links between predator-prey dynamics and sexual selection. The first part of the talk will be really probably 2/3 of the talk, and we're just going to jump right in and thinking about social group fissions. So the underlying question here is really about the role of behavior in shaping population ecology. What's the role of social structure and social behavior in driving population dynamics? And before we get into fissions, let's just think about the dynamics of a social population in general. Two things are always going to be driving population dynamics: births and deaths. And in a social context, these occur within groups. So a birth is going to increase the size of a social group by 1, a death will decrease the size of a social group by 1. So if we think about how density dependence emerges from a birth-death process, we're really thinking about density dependence within a social group. So for example, maybe we have some birth-death process that generates logistic growth. Then we'll get some pattern like this. If we look at group growth rate against group size, we'll see that there's some group level carrying capacity that I'll call K. Below that, we expect our groups to grow. Above it, we expect them to shrink. Alternatively, we might have different patterns of birth and death rates that generate a different pattern of within group growth. Something like an Ali effect, where we have some minimum viable group size that I'm denoting A. We call this the Ali threshold. So below the Ali threshold, we expect our groups to shrink. Only between the Ali threshold and the carrying capacity do groups grow. And the thing that I want to kind of make clear about this slide is that, explicitly, this is all happening within groups. So we tend to think about density dependence at the level of the population. Here, we're really thinking about density dependence at the level of the social group. So if this is the only thing we bake into our model, we have these births and deaths within social groups, we'll get something like this. So this is a simulation of 12 different social groups. We're looking at group size versus time. The groups are fluctuating around the carrying capacity, which is here size 10. These fluctuations look pretty large because the groups are pretty small. So demographic stochasticity has a really large influence on the dynamics. These fluctuations will continue until the groups hit the absorbing state of 0, group extinction, which is marked by the red stars. Because the only thing that's happening is births and deaths within groups, when a group goes extinct, there's nothing that's going to return that lost group to the population. So if we zoom out and look at population size changing through time, we'll get this pattern of exponential decay at the level of the population. As you might expect then, a population like this is going to go extinct quite quickly. So this is extinction probability versus time from the same types of simulations. Here we're looking at starting with 12 groups with a carrying capacity of size 5. So we're starting each group at carrying capacity. We're starting with 60 individuals. We see that by 50 units of time, which is roughly 20 interbirth intervals in this model, the population has almost certainly gone extinct. We can think about what might allow this population to persist for longer. And one kind of obvious choice might be, well, let's just make the population bigger. Let's increase the number of groups. So here we're looking at the same thing, groups with a carrying capacity of size 5, but now we've doubled the number of groups. So we have 24 groups, 120 individuals initially. And we see that we really haven't bought ourselves much more time until extinction. And this might surprise you. We have twice as many groups. What's going on? Well, really the extinction of a population like this is just the sequential extinction of every single group that makes up that population. So yes, we've doubled the number of groups. This means that we're sampling, the time that the last group goes extinct, we're sampling the distribution for time until extinction for each group 2 times more, but we aren't actually changing the underlying distribution. A group of size 5 is going to go extinct really quickly. So a population made up of groups of size 5 is going to go extinct really quickly. We can compare this with what happens if we instead make the groups bigger. So we're going to have these 2 black lines. This is going to be carrying capacity of size 10. We'll start with the same number of individuals, so 6 groups of size 10 for 60 individuals, 12 groups of size 10 for 120 individuals. And we see that the populations made up of these larger groups are going to persist for quite a bit longer, even though the initial population size and the initial number of groups isn't actually larger. And I think it's especially instructive to compare that dashed black line to the solid blue line. The dashed black line has half as many individuals and 4 times fewer social groups than the solid blue line, but it's persisting for much longer because a group of size 10 is going to persist a lot longer than a group of size 5. So everything I'm telling you might make you think, okay, social populations are really extinction prone, and hopefully we have built some intuition about how to think about population dynamics in this context. But really, we've kind of ignored all of the processes that make studying the dynamics of social populations really interesting and to me, really exciting. And those are the processes that go on between social groups. So some of these between group processes are well studied in other contexts. Something like migration, the transfer of individuals between different groups. People have studied this in metapopulations and community in terms of spatial structure a lot. And it probably works pretty similarly with social structure. But what's interesting about social structure is social groups themselves can fission, fuse, and compete with one another in between group processes that really lack analogs in other types of population structure, such as space. And like I kind of said up front, the between group process that I'm really going to focus on for much of this talk is going to be social group fissions. So we're going to take that model I was just showing you and add in group fissions. What we'll assume is that fissions occur at a constant per group rate, and that when a fission occurs, each individual joins daughter group 1, some arbitrary daughter group with probability 0.5. So essentially think of it as groups are fissioning at a constant rate, and when a fission occurs, each individual flips a fair coin to decide if they want to join group 1 or group 2 after the fission. Post-fission group sizes are thus binomially distributed. Well, if we add in fissions to the model, what we see is that we can get this increase in the number of groups through time. So fissions are going to provide a process that's going to replace those groups that are going extinct due to demographic stochasticity. And if the rate that a group fissions is greater than the rate at which a group goes extinct, we'll get this increase in the number of groups through time. But fissions take the same number of individuals, and they distribute them into more groups. So this means that the average size of any group is going to decrease as a result of fissioning. Here, the carrying capacity is size 10. Groups are below the carrying capacity, meaning each group is expected to be growing back towards the carrying capacity. So again, if we zoom out and look at population size, now we actually see we're having an increase in the number of groups through time, and those individual groups are growing, so population size is going to increase exponentially through time. As you might expect, fissions are therefore really important for thinking about extinction risk of social populations. So now we're looking at a graph that shows the probability of extinction against fission rate on a log 10 scale. This is the case that groups grow according to logistic growth. And we see that as we turn up the rate of fissioning, the probability the population goes extinct is decreasing monotonically. We can compare that with what happens if instead groups grow according to an Lee effect. So groups have some minimum viable group size. This is the gray line. We see a very different pattern. The first thing I want to point out, the kind of more obvious conclusion, is just the gray line is above the black line. So if groups grow according to an Lee effect, we have a much higher extinction risk at the level of the population. And this is just because groups with an Lee effect are going to go extinct faster than groups that grow logistically. But there's something more interesting here, which is that the shape is completely different. So we now have this U-shaped influence. So from very low fission rates, as we increase the fission rate, we first see this drop in extinction probability with the Lee effect. And this is for all the reasons we've previously discussed. Fissions are providing some mechanism to replace lost groups from the population, and therefore going to allow the population to be more likely to persist. But we see if we continue to crank up the fission rate, eventually we get this spike in the extinction probability of the population. And the reason for this is because at very high fission rates, we're going to generate very small groups. So groups are actually going to get pushed below the elite threshold, in which case they'll be expected to shrink rather than grow. Meaning that at high fission rates, we also have a high extinction probability when groups grow according to an elite effect. What's interesting, though, is that specific behaviors, specific strategies for how and when groups decide to fission have a really big impact on extinction risk. So we're going to look instead at a fissioning process that's different than what I described before. So there'll be some threshold group size T below which groups never fission. Groups larger than T will then fission at some constant rate that I'll call f of T. So essentially, if you're in a small group, you never fission. Once the group gets sufficiently large, you fission at a constant rate. So this graph I'm about to show you are those two parameters, the fissioning threshold T on the vertical axis, the fission rate given that you're above T on the horizontal axis. First for the case where groups grow logistically. So redder colors are higher extinction risk, and we see essentially all of the conclusions that I've already told you. So the carrying capacity is marked with that black line. So we're more likely to get fissioning lower on the graph and further to the right on the graph, and that's the conditions that lead to the lowest extinction probability. When groups grow logistically, it's good to fission more. Let's compare this with what happens if groups grow according to an Allee effect, but with this fissioning strategy where fissioning only gets turned on above some threshold group size. Well, now we get this pretty interesting pattern. So we see there's this kind of Goldilocks zone that I told you about before, where even at very low fissioning thresholds, at these intermediate fission rates, we get low extinction probability. But to orient you a little more to this graph, so this dashed line, this is twice the Allee threshold. So here the Allee threshold is 2.5, so groups of size 2 expected to shrink, groups of size 3 expected to grow. Twice the Allee threshold means that when a group's fissioning, we're expecting that both of those post-fission groups are larger than the Allee threshold. What we see is that if groups are large enough when they fission, so if the fission threshold is more than twice this Allee threshold and we're never generating very small groups by fissioning, then it becomes beneficial to fission at very high rates. Right? In between these two lines, you just want to be further to the right and you get the lowest extinction probability. It's worth noting that at very high fission thresholds, we start to get a high extinction probability again, and this is because the within group dynamics are rarely going to push the group to be so much larger than carrying capacity. So you're unlikely to ever fission in that case. So what we're seeing is that specific behaviors that groups might undertake when deciding when to fission can have these really important implications for shaping the extinction risk of social populations. That kind of brings us to a behavioral question, which is, well, how is it that organisms actually behave when they participate in a group fission? And this is an interesting question because fissions are these highly complex collective decisions that are likely to have really important fitness consequences. So what we're looking at here is an actual social network for a baboon group immediately before it underwent a fission. So a fission is, by definition, somehow cutting some of those social ties in order to split this network into two different groups. We know in baboons and in many organisms, including in humans, that social connectedness predicts fitness. Individuals that are more socially connected tend to have higher survival. So what that means is that individuals should be very motivated to retain their social partnerships when they're undergoing these group fissions. But some individuals have to lose social partners in order to successfully split this group in two. So what strategies can individuals and groups take when they're deciding how to fission? To get at this, we developed a series of computational models of group fissions that we put on a spectrum from more democratic decision-making to more despotic decision-making. So this democracy algorithm is the case that each individual controls their outcome after a group fission. So essentially, we seed the daughter groups after the fission with two individuals, and we cycle through the rest of the group, essentially asking each individual, do you want to join post-fission group 1 or do you want to join post-fission group 2? In contrast, despotic decision-making takes some individual in the network, for example, an individual with high dominance rank, and asks them, who do you want to take with you over the course of the fission? That one individual controls the fission outcome, essentially evicting all of the other individuals from the social group. So using this comparison between more democratic algorithms and more despotic algorithms, we asked which was less disruptive to the social network. So we simulated those two algorithms on 7 different network structures. And what this graph I'm about to show you is essentially what percentage of bonds were broken by the two algorithms, rescaled in some way that isn't really important for our purposes. But basically, the way you should think about this is higher on the graph means that more bonds were broken during the fission. That would be presumably a bad outcome, a more disruptive fission. Whereas lower on the graph, this would be the case that fewer bonds were broken by the fission. The fission was less disruptive to the pre-existing social conditions. Oops. And what we see is that, on average, these more democratic fissions had a lower percentage of bonds broken. More democratic fissions were less disruptive to the existing social network structure. So that's an interesting theoretical result, but it's worth actually thinking about, again, can we think of some examples of what real organisms are doing? And in order to get at this, we're going to use this really rich data set from the Amboseli Baboon Research Project. So this project was started around 60 years ago by Gene Altman. It's currently directed by Susan Alberts, a close collaborator of mine. And this is a population of habituated yellow baboons with some natural Anubis baboon admixture that lives in and around Amboseli National Park in southern Kenya. And all of this data that I'm going to be talking to you about is collected by an experienced field team that recognizes approximately 300 individuals on site and is with the animals 6 days a week, 5 hours at a time. So over the 55 years that this population has been under study, there's 7 examples of group fissions for which we have behavioral data. And what we can do is we can take those 7 group fissions, which are the 7 different group names at the bottom of this graph, and simulate the fission using our 2 algorithms, democracy and despotism. And then we can ask, how well do these 2 different algorithms predict which bonds were broken and which bonds were maintained by the baboons in the observed fission events? So higher on this graph means that the algorithm did better at matching the observed fission. Lower means that it was a worse match. And we see in 6 of the 7 cases that the democracy algorithm does a better job at predicting which bonds were broken versus maintained in the actual baboon fissions. And this suggests to us essentially that individuals are indeed kind of controlling which post-fission group they join. But we can actually go further with this data set and try to better understand what information individuals are using when they're making those decisions about how to fission. So to do this, let me first kind of describe to you how a baboon fission works. So baboons live in these incredibly stable social groups. They tend to, all individuals are spending every day together. They don't subgroup, they're not fission-fusion. And when a fission occurs, subgrouping begins. So essentially what will happen is you'll have this large stable group, they'll split up and subgroup, and then they'll come back together. And then they'll split up and subgroup in a different way, and then they'll come back together. And they'll continue this process of subgrouping for anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 years before they ultimately fission. And what we can do is actually look at which subgroup an individual is in over the course of the fission process. So this is a trajectory of 2 different males switching between different subgroups called Hoki's group and Snap's group. So this male, Ayub, starts off in Hoki's group and rapidly and frequently switches between being in Hoki's group and in Snap's group. We call this floating between the different subgroups. Ayub here floated 17 times over the course of this fission. This male, Bolt, however, has a very different trajectory. Bolt starts in Hoki's subgroup. He goes over to Snap's subgroup and spends a couple of months there before returning to Hoki's subgroup and ultimately staying there, floating twice. The one switched to Snap's and the one switched back to Hoki's. So what we're going to do is look at what predicts whether or not individuals will float, what predicts whether or not they'll switch which subgroup they're in. So we're going to break this down by sex. So first, let's look at females. So the vertical axis of this graph will be the percentage of females that float, the percentage of females that switch which subgroup they're in. And the horizontal axis is the percentage of bonds that are broken by a given subgrouping pattern. So over on the left, this is the case that a certain pattern of subgrouping is breaking very few bonds. And over on the right, that's the case that a pattern of subgrouping is breaking many bonds. And what we see is that females are more likely to float when more bonds are broken by a given subgrouping pattern, suggesting that females really are concerned about maintaining their social relationships over the course of a fission, potentially explaining why it takes so long for them to ultimately decide how to fission. The story is very different for males. For males, the percentage of bonds broken does not predict whether or not a male floats. To look at what predicts whether a male floats, let's look at the percentage of the male's subgroup that is female. So over on the left of this graph, this is the case that males are in male-biased subgroups. And over on the right of the graph, this is the case that males are in female-biased subgroups. And what we see is that males are more likely to float when they're in male-biased subgroups, suggesting that males are primarily concerned about access to reproductive opportunities over the course of the fission. And I think I can put this no better than Gene Altman did about 30 years ago. Primate males are just following the females. That's essentially what that last result tells us. So we've seen that fissions are ecologically important, and we've seen that we can learn a lot about what organisms care about by how they make decisions during fissions. What I haven't told you about is why do fissions occur in the first place? And this is kind of the evolutionary side of the story. And before I answer that question of why do groups fission, I want to introduce a second between-group process into our model of population dynamics, specifically between-group competition. So the way we're specifically going to model between-group competition is going to be to assume that the rate that any group encounters one another is kind of dependent on the number of groups in the population. So the rate that one group experiences between-group competition with any other group is increasing with the number of groups. And then when we have one of these competition events, what we're going to do is assume that one individual from one of these two groups dies. And it doesn't have to be kind of literally that this is the process that we're imagining, but the idea is essentially that as groups are interacting more, we're getting some elevation in the death rate. Critically, we're going to assume, following empirical evidence, that smaller groups are more likely to lose in between-group competition, more likely to be the group that experiences a death. So when we add between-group competition to the model, we see this pattern that looks a lot like logistic growth at the level of the whole population. And I first want to unpack why this is happening, because it's worth noting that there's actually no explicit population level density dependence that we've baked into the birth and death rates. It's really emerging based on the interaction at the level of social groups themselves. So with very few social groups in the population, the rate that those groups are interacting is going to be quite low. And therefore, the rate of between-group competition is very low, meaning that group extinctions will be pretty rare. We're going to get a lot of group fissions, and we get this increase in the number of groups through time. As we increase in the number of groups through time, the rate at which we have these between-group competitions is going to increase, ultimately increasing the rate at which groups are going extinct. And eventually that group extinction rate is going to overtake the group fission rate, allowing the number of groups to stabilize through time, leading to this pattern of logistic growth at the level of the population. Right, this is all happening due to the nature of these between-group interactions. What's kind of baked into the model, however, and again, this is following empirical evidence, is that there's this trade-off between within and between group competition. So what we're looking at here is our two different mechanisms leading to death. There's this kind of baseline death rate due to within group competition, which we see is increasing with group size. So we have more within group competition in larger groups. That makes sense. The second panel is looking at the death rate due to between group competition against group size. We see that this death rate is decreasing with group size, due to our assumption that smaller groups do worse in between-group competition. So group size is mediating this trade-off between these two levels of competition. This is going to be really important for thinking about how fission rates evolve. So a former undergraduate I was working with, Silas Hicks, now actually a PhD student at UC Davis, kind of funnily enough, is wanted to look into this question. So the graph I'm about to show you looks at the evolutionary equilibrium for the fission rate against the strength of these two types of competition. So the strength of within-group competition is on the horizontal axis. The strength of between-group competition is on the vertical axis. Lighter colors are higher equilibrium fission rates. And we see that these fission rates evolve to be the fastest when within-group competition is strong relative to between-group competition. And to understand what's going on here, we want to look at the way that the fission rate shapes the average size of social groups. So this is same panels as before, but now average group size, where lighter colors indicate larger group sizes. And we see what's happening is essentially that the equilibrium fission rate is taking us to have, so fast equilibrium fission rate leads to small groups. We're getting small groups when within group competition is strong and between group competition is weak. On the other hand, if within group competition is weak and between group competition is strong, we're getting the evolution of slow fission rates, which is leading to these large group sizes, right? These are the conditions where small group size is more beneficial. These are the conditions where large group size is more beneficial. The fission rate is evolving to shape this trade-off, to balance this trade-off between these two levels of competition based on how the fission rate shapes the group size. So this first part of the talk really looked at social group fissions as kind of a case study in how we can get a more holistic understanding of biological processes by explicitly taking a perspective that links ecology, evolution, and behavior. Right, we started with that ecological question, which is essentially, why do we care about fissions in the first place? And we saw how fissions are important for allowing for sustained population growth. We then asked how fissions actually happened using some empirical data as well on the baboons. And we saw essentially that, the story there is a bit more complicated, but essentially individuals care how they fission, right? Individuals are making decisions in order to optimize something about their social environment through a fission. And finally, we looked at the evolutionary question of why do groups fission? And we see that fissions allow you to escape within group competition. So now I want to transition and talk about a second kind of area of my research that I wanted to tell you about, which is more thinking about reproductive behavior rather than social behavior. And this is links between predator-prey dynamics and sexual selection. So the kind of backdrop for this part of the talk is going to be eco-evolutionary dynamics. The idea that ecology doesn't just set the stage for evolution to play out on, but that evolution actually has an active role in shaping ecological dynamics. And the focus for how people study eco-evolutionary dynamics is on traits that have really obvious ecological relevance, like those that control resource acquisition. But we know that sexual selection can also drive rapid evolution and thus may play a role in eco-evolutionary dynamics. This survey by Eric Svensson came up with a couple dozen examples, but found that fewer than 5% of studies on eco-evolutionary dynamics actually mention sexual selection. So I'd characterize this gap as essentially that we don't know what role reproductive behavior plays in shaping this feedback between ecology and evolution. One area where this is likely really important is in how predation shapes the cost of sexual displays. So sexual displays, like a peacock's tail that is used to attract mates, is also known from a wide variety of taxa and a wide variety of sensory modalities to increase predation risk. This is actually a really common verbal model for how sexual displays are ultimately limited, is through predation. But if we actually look at the evolutionary models that have been developed, we see that these models are in some ways fundamentally incompatible with interpreting costs on sexual displays as coming from predation, because these classic models don't account for the explicit density-dependent feedback that occurs through a predator-prey dynamic. And I'm just going to note up front that these models tend to predict that sexual displays will evolve monotonically, either to fixation or to be more elaborate, something we call a Fisherian runaway, or to be lost if the costs on those displays are too large. So we wanted to develop a model that explicitly linked predator-prey dynamics to evolution by sexual selection. And this model tracks four things. It tracks the density of some predator, the density of female prey, and the density of male prey. But critically, male prey are going to also have some sexual display that could vary. So that's this trait value Z. So this more showy male would have a higher value of Z. This drabber male would have a lower value of Z, a less elaborate display. So the model assumes that prey grow logistically without predation and explicitly models predator-prey dynamics. For those of you familiar with this type of model, we're assuming a type 2 functional response. We're building off of a Rosenzweig-McArthur model. Critically, we're going to assume that males with more elaborate displays are going to have increased predation risk. That's the parameter S. But at the same time, males with more elaborate displays are going to be preferred by females. And this is the parameter A. So the really critical thing that I just want to reiterate for contextualizing or interpreting what I'm about to show you is that males can express a sexual display that faces this trade-off between natural and sexual selection. The sexual display will increase a male's predation risk while simultaneously increasing its success in female choice. So the first question we can ask is the kind of obvious evolutionary question: how do predator-prey dynamics affect what we see in terms of evolution, these sexually selected traits? So this is a time series run of the model. We see this predator-prey cycle. This should come as no surprise. We know that these types of consumer resource systems can cycle. But what's really important here is that the strength of selection, the strength of natural selection against a sexual display is fundamentally linked to the density of predators in the environment. So as we get this predator population cycling in density, we're also getting fluctuating selection on the sexual display, meaning that we can get these evolutionary cycles, these sustained cycles, in the value of the sexual display. And I told you previously that these similar models without predator-prey dynamics would predict a monotonic increase or decrease in the display. So this is different from what we've seen before, and I think it's different in a really important way, which is that if someone were to go out and measure a system like this empirically for 5 generations or something, we might see it only increasing or only decreasing. And we might conclude that we're seeing a Fisherian runaway in action, or we might conclude that we're going to see this display ultimately being lost. When in reality, what this model suggests is, if we look over a longer time scale, there might be these sort of non-equilibrium dynamics that we see in these types of populations. We can also look at the reverse feedback, though, which is that, do these evolutionary processes, does evolution of these sexual displays actually affect predator-prey dynamics? So to look at this, we're going to look at phase space. So this is a graph that's going to put predator density on the vertical axis, prey density on the horizontal axis. And I'm going to look at 2 cases, a case without evolution and a case with evolution. So first, the case without evolution. Here we're just seeing a classic predator-prey cycle, just following that little loop that we've drawn. That's what we would see. How does this cycle change if we allow the evolution of these sexual displays? Well, we see it changes pretty dramatically. And there's a few things I could point out, but I think the most notable thing I want to point out is that the width of this line in the horizontal direction is very much compressed, meaning that the prey is not cycling nearly as much when there's also evolution going on. And the reason for this is because prey now have a way to respond to high predation risk. Right? Without evolution, the only way prey respond to high predation risk is by getting eaten. But when they can also evolve, prey will evolve to reduce their predation risk in these high predation risk environments, mitigating the bust in the prey population and the cycle. So the kind of last set of things I want to tell you about is how behavior plays a role in all of this. Right? I've told you a lot about the evolution of sexual displays, but we haven't really talked about those preferences, which is really the behavior in this side of the model. And what we'll see is that these are also really important. So it's quite straightforward to modify the model to also include the evolution of preferences. Again, following empirical evidence, we'll assume that those preferences are costly in terms of predation risk. So I'm just going to have a similar time series as before, but we'll have a brown line that shows the frequency of those preferences. So in a case that the preferences can't evolve, we might see something like this, where we're reaching some stable equilibrium. But if we take the exact same parameter values and allow preferences to evolve freely, we start to recover or see an expansion in the region in which we see these eco-evolutionary cycles. And the reason is that as the predator population density is cycling, we're also getting fluctuating selection on the frequency of preferences. This fluctuation in the preference frequency is going to lead to fluctuating sexual selection. So now the sexual display has fluctuating natural selection, it has fluctuating sexual selection, and we're getting this enhancement of the cycles that we saw previously as a result of this. And you might be wondering, okay, Brian, you're kind of showing some of these really complicated graphs. Like, are there really any examples of this that happen in nature? And to kind of turn to thinking about some of those empirical examples or potential examples, I want to talk about another collaboration I have with some empiricist, which is looking at these Pacific field crickets. So Pacific field crickets are native to Australia and island hopped along with Polynesian settlers across the Pacific Islands, ultimately reaching Hawaii. And on Hawaii, these crickets encounter a parasitoid fly that is invasive from North America. This parasitoid fly can be seen on the back of this cricket. So what the fly does is it listens to the calling song of the male cricket, the song that the cricket uses to attract females, and it orients to that song. It will then go to the cricket, inject eggs into the cricket, the larvae hatch and literally eat the cricket from the inside out, ultimately killing it. So it's a parasitoid example of the same types of dynamics that we've been talking about. And on Hawaii, about 20 years ago, it was observed that these crickets stopped singing. And in the last 10 years, kind of all hell has broken loose in this population. There's been an explosion in novel morphs, different song types in these crickets. Each of these new song types, purring, small wing, and so on, are less attractive to females, but also help to escape the parasitoid fly. There's some longitudinal data collection that shows we have maintenance of variation in all of these morphs. There might even be some hint of a cycle, but we don't have sufficient timescale to actually assess this. So along with Robin Tingatella and some members of her lab, we built a pretty specific model to this system to try to make predictions over a longer timescale. They had, I want to say, around 10 generations. We're able to get, this timescale is generations, so we're looking at over 1,000 generations here for two different song types, ancestral song in green and this purring song in blue. And we see that it's possible, based on these model predictions, that we will see these long sustained cycles in this population, or I should say long transient cycles in this population. These are damped, but of course empirically relevant. They're persisting for over 1,000 generations. And we're seeing the coexistence of these different song types. One thing that you might be, that's kind of interesting to also point out about these crickets is that we're only seeing this explosion in novelty in the sexual signal on the Hawaiian population of these crickets, which is only where these parasitoid flies co-occur with the crickets. So to try to understand what's going on here, Gabrielle Welsh, a current postdoc at UChicago, former PhD student in Robin Tingatella's lab, collected some data on female preferences from these different populations. So these are Australian population, French Polynesian population, I think from Moorea, and then a Hawaiian population, and looked at how accepting these females were to silent males. So essentially higher up would be weaker female preferences. And we see that the island populations, these are two replicates from each, the island populations and the Hawaiian populations in particular, had the weakest preferences. So Hawaiian females have these relaxed preferences, and we can turn back to some theory to try to understand the implications of this. So this is just looking at the dynamics of prey, predator, some novel display in blue, and preferences in brown. And what the model predicts is if there's no cost to preferences, for example, if there's no fly, then preferences remain strong, and a novel signal can't really invade. A novel song, a novel morph can't invade. Whereas if we turn on cost to preferences, for example, females are sometimes also being parasitized due to spending time with calling males, then we see something different. We see first we lose these preferences, and then a novel display is able, a novel morph is able to invade. So it's possible that these novel morphs are evolving as a result of parasitism pressure on Hawaii. So yeah, in the second part of the talk, what we saw is that predation and sexual selection is another kind of context in which we see these really interesting links between ecology, evolution, and behavior, and really kind of taking this integrative approach of trying to link these different areas gives us a more holistic understanding of how these systems are going to play out. So I now want to transition to thinking about just what I'm hoping you take home from this talk. And I guess maybe the obvious one is that I hope that you're excited by this prospect of trying to take these integrative approaches and thinking about linking ecology, evolution, and behavior. And I think there's a few messages, a few general reasons that this is important that some results from this talk really clarified. So The first one is that if we exist in these different silos, this can prevent us from coming up with these holistic answers to questions that we care about. For example, when we're thinking about extinction risk in social populations, we saw that we really need to think about both ecology and behavior as what drives those extinction risks. We also saw ways that when we apply results from one field into another, this can actually alter the predictions that we might make. For example, by introducing predator-prey dynamics into models of sexual selection, we see these new evolutionary dynamics in sexually selected traits. And finally, there's examples of new questions that exist when we start to poke at this interface. For example, the way in which understanding fission rates, how fission rates evolve due to these different ecological trade-offs. So this is kind of what I view as my interests. Obviously, today I've told you about the two that I'm maybe most excited about, which is dynamics of social populations and the role of ecology in sexual selection. But I'm also interested in understanding how ecology shapes social evolution, how ecological and evolutionary processes jointly drive biodiversity and the evolution of same-sex sexual behavior. So even though I didn't have a chance to talk about this, these are things that I'd be excited to talk to any of you about if they pique your interest or pique your interest more than what I actually did tell you about, which I guess I hope isn't necessarily the case. But, so yeah, with that, thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Right. I can schlep some mics around if anyone has any questions.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. It was really great. I just have a question about the fission dynamics. So I was wondering if you've thought at all about or could speculate, because I'm sure you've thought about it, how kind of external forces would shift that situation, maybe especially when not all individuals in a group behave equally or make decisions equally. So I'm thinking about, like, in the baboon example, maybe there's poaching and there might be some sort of preference for a certain demographic in that way, or you could think about environmental change decreasing a resource pool and kind of artificially raising that elite threshold and bringing K and the elite threshold closer together. And I was wondering if you've taken a look at that or if you could speculate in any way there.
Yeah. It's not something that I've really done anything on, but I'm always happy to speculate. I think that I guess the thing that the thing I'm kind of thinking about there is that I think this is part of the reason it takes so long. I think there probably are quite a few conflicts of interest over the course of the fission. And I guess, hinted at some of them, or I guess talked about some of them, but not in those terms, which is that, who gets to stay with their friends and who has to lose a friend is like one conflict of interest. From the male perspective, like which male ends up with more females, or more females that are more immediately sexually receptive is another conflict of interest. And I think that in many ways, like, they don't really want a fission, right? Like, I think the status quo is sort of nice. And these groups probably get quite a bit larger as a consequence of some of these things. These groups probably get quite a bit larger than they should be because, there's all of these reasons that individuals are trying not to fission, or that individuals are constantly moving between subgroups or bringing the subgroups back together. I think differences or conflicts of interest between males and females are probably quite common, and there's some evidence of this in terms of how they move, how groups move. So I do think this is probably an important constraint on when fissions occur and how fissions occur that makes it harder, probably makes it take longer, makes fissions less likely, but not something that I've really done anything towards. But yeah, really interesting to think about.
Interesting talk. It makes me think about so many things that you could potentially model with some of these, thinking about diseases and thinking about, as she just suggested, resource limitation due to climate change, one of the examples that we have around here, that's a local example, which might be interesting for you, is the singing toadfish, where we have the big males have a big deep voice and they attract females, but there's also sneaker males who pretend to look like females and they sneak in and reproduce. So there's all kinds of interesting dynamics that would be really suitable for what you're dealing with in terms of fitness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that I didn't really talk in much length about some of the complexities of the crickets, but I think some of what you're talking about is actually also playing out in the crickets. So one of the reasons we think that we're actually getting these less attractive morphs sticking around, and this is something Marlene Zook has worked on quite a bit, is that some of these novel morphs, or the silent males, are acting as satellite males. And essentially, they're also attracted to the singing males, and then they're intercepting females in exactly the same way you're describing with the sneaker males. So I think, yeah, a lot of connections there, for sure.
Thanks, Brian. So for the social group fission, it seems like social groups are often kin groups with individuals of varying relatedness. And I was wondering if you thought about considering relatedness and how that might influence fission decisions, and whether carrying capacity of group size might depend on relatedness of individuals, and whether thinking about inclusive fitness would change any of these predictions.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So I guess, so this is actually something that I didn't do, but before my time, people have done with some of the primate fusions, both in this baboon population I told you about, and also in other populations. And we do know that that individuals are more likely to stick with kin through the course of fissions. So this is something that also plays a role that's sort of all confounded, or it confounds with, in the same way, it confounds what I said, which is that kin are more likely to be social partners. So then, it's unclear to what extent they really care about kin, or if they just like have their friends. I don't know, in that case, how consequential it is. But I do think this is something else that's interesting to think about in terms of the fissions, because what I would sort of predict is that this is going to help. The more related a group is, the more that the group level outcome, what's best for the group and what's best for the individuals, it becomes more in line. And I think that this might help mitigate some of the complexity that I was, talking to Maddie about, in terms of actually helping the group kind of fission in the best way by avoiding some of these conflicts of interest due to these inclusive fitness concerns. It's another thing that, I think is really interesting, not something I've sort of done anything on at this point, but yeah.
That was cool. I have another question about the group fission. I liked your distinction between the two different ways they might do it, the democratic and the despotism way. And I liked the data on the males bouncing between groups. Do you think that different individuals might fall into one of those camps and how they decide more? Did you look at if you switch the order of who gets to decide where they go, if that changes things too, or?
Yeah. So I think I think that it's sort of actually democratic as a constraint. I think essentially the reason that the baboon fissions look more democratic in many ways is essentially that it's just too hard or not worth one's effort to try to control another individual's behavior. And you see that, so I think this could be really different depending on the species. So for those of you that were at lunch today, I was talking about different types of baboons, some of them being a bit more tolerant than others. And I think that this population that we're looking at, they tend to live in pretty large multi-male groups. And I think they essentially, it's just not that much a part of their behavioral repertoire to like try to control group membership. Because the groups are just so large, I think that it's just too hard of a problem to make it worthwhile. So I think essentially what's going on is just that like, there's not really a way to keep an individual from coming to a different group. So it's a little unclear like how you could have, in some sense, I think that the way I've presented it, they're almost like group level strategies. Like it's hard to imagine how, I guess you could imagine some mixture, but I guess like, it's not like each individual can kind of do their own thing. Yeah, did I answer your question?
Yeah. I think, do you, like, if it's democratic too, like, do you think that an individual is choosing to join a group based on who's already there? Like if the order of them choosing changes, does that change outcomes
I see.
too?
Yeah. So this isn't something that we kind of allow for in the model. Like in the simulations, we just sort of say, okay, we're going to randomly cycle through everyone and make them choose. Which was, mostly for convenience. Like it's not, it'd be quite a bit more computationally expensive. I think what the baboons are actually doing is essentially, you can almost think of it as like a negotiation when they're subgrouping. It's like they're sort of saying, okay, what if we try this? And then individuals are switching because there isn't a discrete instant at which the fission occurs. It's actually quite a long process. I mean, in some cases, like I said, it's like a 2-year-long process. So I think that because in nature, the way it plays out is over a longer time scale, it allows for individuals to update those choices, making it so that the order doesn't really matter because there is no real order. In the model, I think that some of the variation that we saw around those outcomes might be explained by the order in which they were randomly chosen.
Could you talk about what a model would look like where there was fusion or two groups coming together, and if there are any circumstances in which that would be beneficial to escape extinction at either group or population level? Yeah,
so this is something that, that this model I was telling you about, we did look at. So fusions, I guess a couple of thoughts. So one is that they're actually essentially never beneficial at the level of the population. And the reason is because from the perspective of an entire population, a fusion is basically like a death of a group, right? Like your number of groups is actually just, even if you fuse, like you've saved some of those individuals, but then you've reduced the number of groups and this, within group density dependence kicks back in and it doesn't really matter, essentially. It doesn't matter over much of a time scale that you've saved those individuals. One thing that is really interesting about fusions is that if you make the assumption that I think makes sense, which is that fusions are most likely to occur when there's more groups in the population, then you also get this pattern of logistic growth at the population level. And there, birth and death rates really don't depend at all on population size. You're just getting this population regulation because when there's few groups, there's more fissions than fusions. And when there's a lot of groups, when there's few groups, there's more fissions than fusions. I don't know if that's what I said or not. When there's many groups, there's more fusions than fissions. So this kind of stabilizes the number of groups, actually leading to, it looks like logistic growth, but actually birth and death rates are completely independent of population size.
Hello. I think we're going to have to call it there. Thank you very much, Brian, for coming to visit us in Chadden, and thank you, everyone, for asking questions.
Thank you.